I should have known better than to take that job. I'm not one to believe in superstitions or ghost stories. I'd always dismissed the warnings from locals about the old factory on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, its once pristine walls now cracked and crumbling. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened there. People spoke of hearing voices at night, of shadows moving on their own. But I didn't believe any of it. I just needed the paycheck. The factory had been closed for so long that it barely registered on anyone's radar anymore. The place was rusting into oblivion, left to decay in peace. Or so I thought. When the job posting appeared, promising good wages and overtime for maintenance work, I didn't hesitate. I'd seen the building from the outside 100 times, and I figured it couldn't be that bad. Sure, the place had its reputation, but I wasn't scared of a little dust in some old equipment. I dealt with worse. The first day I stepped through the factory's rusted gates, I should have turned around. But I didn't. I walked through the large, heavy doors, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Musty, old, like something forgotten for far too long. It was a damp, oppressive kind of air, the kind that clung to you like cobwebs. The interior was massive, far larger than I'd expected. The high ceilings were dotted with broken lights, their flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant sound of wind howling through cracked windows. The supervisor, a grizzled man named Richard, gave me a quick tour of the place. He didn't talk much. His eyes were too tired, too haunted. It wasn't until we reached the assembly line that I felt a strange unease crawl up my spine. It wasn't the fact that the assembly line was old or that the machines were covered in layers of dust. It was the stillness. Everything was frozen in time, as though the factory had simply stopped in the middle of a shift. The conveyor belt was empty, but I could almost imagine the hum of the machines and the clink of tools as they moved in a blur of motion. I asked Richard about it. He gave me a long look, his eyes narrowing before he spoke. "Don't ask too many questions about this place," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "There's a reason it's been abandoned. You'll learn soon enough." The warning didn't sit right with me, but I shrugged it off. I'd heard about workers leaving in the middle of their shifts, about strange occurrences that made people uneasy, but I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. People leave jobs all the time, especially in a place like this, right? Richard left me alone to get started, and as the sound of his boots faded, I took my first real look around. The machines on the line were large, hulking things. They seemed almost too advanced for their time. Some of the equipment had strange markings on them, symbols I couldn't recognize. As I moved closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. I reached out to touch one of the machines, but something stopped me, like a whisper, a sensation that prickled the back of my neck. I pulled my hand back quickly, dismissing it as nerves. The factory was old, sure, but it was still a factory, just a place to work. I started working on the first task they'd given me, inspecting the belts and gears of the assembly line. As I moved deeper into the factory, the quiet felt heavier, more suffocating. It was like the air was thickening, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I turned a corner into a smaller hallway, and that's when I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, beyond the shadows of the broken lights, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But no, something was there, something dark, something wrong. It was a shape, a shadow, standing completely still in the corner. But even in the dim light, I could make out something unmistakable, a pair of eyes staring back at me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a second, I thought I might be dreaming. The figure in the corner was dark, almost blending with the shadows, but its eyes, they were clear, too clear, and they were watching me. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that moment, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow didn't move, blink, just watched me. The factory seemed to grow colder, quieter. Then just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was seeing things after being in the factory for too long. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This place shouldn't be open. It wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting for something. and I wasn't sure I was supposed to be here when that something finally came. I thought about leaving, but the thought never fully formed. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was the thought of the job and the bills I had to pay. But I stayed. And when I stepped back into the main assembly line, I didn't know then just how much the factory would change me. But I would find out soon enough. The strange feeling I had when I first walked through the factory was still with me, lingering like a cold draft that refused to be shaken off. It wasn't the building itself that unnerved me. Factories are supposed to be dark, old, and filled with the strange machinery of forgotten work. No, it was something else. It was the way the shadows moved, the way the lights flickered in rhythm, almost as if they were responding to something I couldn't see. By the second day, I was starting to wonder if Richard had been trying to warn me more than I realized. I spent most of my time working alone, fixing old pipes, oiling the machines, and checking the assembly line's components. Every now and then, I'd hear a soft mechanical hum, like something had turned on in the distance, but I'd quickly dismiss it. It was probably the old equipment, still running on its own, still holding on to some semblance of life, but then it started getting worse. The factory had always been quiet, but the silence now felt suffocating, almost oppressive. As the hours stretched on, the flickering lights above began to grow more erratic, their intermittent buzzing cutting through the still air. The noise itself was grating, like a malfunctioning circuit struggling to stay alive. I tried to adjust the wiring and switch on the backup lights, but nothing worked. The factory had plunged into darkness too many times to count. The air had turned cold again, colder than before. But I didn't dare check the thermostat. There was no point. I knew the temperature didn't match the chill I felt. This wasn't just the damp of an old building. It was as if the place itself was alive, breathing. I was working in the far corner of the factory, near the storage room where old blueprints and broken machines were dumped. There was a thick dust in the air, the kind that made you cough after a few minutes of inhaling it. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, bouncing off stacks of metal parts, broken crates, and long-forgotten tools. My eyes were strained, but I couldn't stop looking. There was something about the way the shadows shifted in the corners of the room. Something not quite right. I saw it again. Movement. At first it was a blur, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to tired eyes and the eerie glow of the faulty lights, but it happened again. And this time, I was ready. I stood absolutely still, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands clenching the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The light above me flickered once more, casting everything in a sickly yellow hue, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, and hunched over, standing just past the row of old machines. It was barely visible, like a shadow that bled into the background, but there was no mistaking it. I could see the faintest outline, a person, or something that resembled one. But its features were distorted, blurry, like looking at a reflection through fogged glass. I froze, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. The factory held its breath, the air thick with something that made it hard to even think. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move, my body frozen in place by the overwhelming presence of the thing in front of me. And then it moved. It was slow at first, as though testing the space between us. But as the shadowed figure took a step forward, it became clear that it wasn't walking. No, it was gliding. Its limbs moved unnaturally, jerking at odd angles, like it was being pulled by some invisible force. The lights flickered violently as the thing closed the distance between us. Every movement it made felt wrong, like the air itself was trembling at its presence. I should have screamed, I should have run, but I couldn't. I stood paralyzed, watching as the figure drew nearer. It was so close now that I could feel its cold presence pressing down on me, could hear its distorted breath, like something trying to exhale after drowning. The moment it reached me, everything went dark. The lights above us sputtered and died, plunging the room into complete blackness. I couldn't see a thing, not even the outline of my own hands. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I fumbled to turn on the flashlight, my fingers trembling with fear. When the beam flickered back to life, the factory was empty. The figure was gone. I stood there in the darkened room, my heart racing in my chest. The silence returned, heavier this time. My skin prickled with the lingering sensation of something being just out of reach, watching, waiting. It didn't make sense. I hadn't imagined it. I knew I hadn't. But when I turned back to the workbench, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single, muddy handprint smeared across the metal surface. It was large, too large to be mine. And there was something else. A noise, faint at first but unmistakable. The sound of something scraping along the floor, dragging its feet. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound, but I didn't need to see it. I felt it. The shadow was back. And this time it wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me to move. I turned and bolted, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The factory seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as I raced down the dark hallways, hearing only the sound of my own frantic breathing and the faintest echo of footsteps behind me. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw it. The figure, closer than ever before, standing in the hallway just ahead. I ran faster, not daring to look back. The sound of scraping growing louder with every step, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that factory anymore. Something had awoken in those shadows, something that shouldn't be there. And I was only just beginning to realize that I wasn't just working in an abandoned factory. I was being hunted. By the time the third day rolled around, I was barely functioning on little more than adrenaline and a steadily mounting sense of dread. I kept telling myself I had imagined the figure, that it was just the dark corners of the factory playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The handprint on the workbench was still there, its impression cold and distinct, as if whatever had left it had only just stepped away. The factory was alive in a way I couldn't explain. And it wasn't just the machines that groaned and moaned as if they were reaching for something. It was the way the building itself seemed to move. The way the lights flickered with an unsettling regularity. And the shadows. They were everywhere, lurking in places they shouldn't be. Richard had warned me that the factory had a mind of its own, but I had dismissed his words as paranoia. Now, I wasn't so sure. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of cold air that seeped in from cracks in the walls felt like the factory was testing me, seeing how far it could push me before I broke. Today, my job was to inspect the assembly line and make sure everything was in working order. The line had been malfunctioning the day before, but there was nothing unusual about it, just a few gears out of place. Or so I thought. I walked through the main hall toward the far end of the line. The sound of my boots echoed through the empty space, the clanking of distant machines barely audible beneath the hum of the factory's pulse. The lights overhead flickered again, casting long, exaggerated shadows along the walls. I glanced up, but when my eyes scanned the line, I froze. The dark corner of the assembly line was different. It wasn't just the lack of light, it was more like the shadows had gathered there, pulled there. A strange heaviness filled the air, as if something had taken root in that corner and was feeding off the darkness. I swallowed hard. That corner had always seemed off, but I'd never really paid attention to it. It was tucked away in a part of the factory I didn't have to go to often, behind the towering machines that were meant to be more decorative than functional. It was the part of the line that no one really bothered with anymore. But today, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing me to it. I took a step forward, and then another, until I was standing just a few feet from the corner. The shadows there twisted in strange ways, not following the direction of the light. They seemed alive. My eyes darted between the machines, trying to convince myself that this was just another trick of the factory. An odd angle, a combination of shadows playing on tired eyes. But I couldn't deny the unease creeping up my spine. I knelt down to inspect the gears and mechanisms, hoping that if I focused on the work, I could shake off the creeping dread gnawing at the back of my mind. But as my hand brushed over the metal, I felt something. Cold, slick, and unnatural. It wasn't grease, it was wet. I jerked my hand back, heart racing. I looked down and saw a trail of what could only be described as black sludge, smeared across the floor beneath the machines. I recoiled instinctively, my stomach turning, but then I realized something far worse. The sludge wasn't just on the floor. It was moving, Slowly, sluggishly, like something was crawling beneath the surface, and then it stopped. Everything fell silent. The factory, once filled with the faint hum of dying machines and the soft clinking of loose parts, now seemed to be holding its breath. The lights overhead flickered once more, casting long, jagged shadows that swayed unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the machines in the corner. The sound of metal against metal. But it wasn't a normal malfunctioning noise. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like something was deliberately dragging itself across the floor. My skin prickled. The temperature in the room dropped, the cold seeping into my bones. I could feel something staring at me from the shadows, its presence more tangible than anything I had ever experienced. I took a cautious step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Maybe I thought that stepping away would make whatever it was go back to hiding, go back to the shadows. But I was wrong. The scraping noise grew louder, faster, and before I knew it, I was moving. My feet were carrying me backward, away from the corner, away from the growing noise, but my body was too slow. I turned to run, but as I did, I felt it. A hand, cold, clammy, and wet, grabbed my ankle. I screamed, jerking my leg forward, but the grip was too strong. I looked down, and what I saw nearly made me faint. A figure, no, not a person, a thing, dragging itself from the shadows. It was covered in a slick black substance, its body a tangle of twisted limbs, too many for its frail form. Its face, or what was left of it, was a featureless, blank mask, save for two empty sockets where eyes should have been. I kicked out in a panic, my foot connecting with something solid. The grip on my ankle loosened just long enough for me to pull free, and I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, my footsteps pounding against the cold concrete, the scraping sound growing fainter with every turn I made. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I barreled through the hallways, past the machines, past the shadows, until I finally reached the front doors. Without thinking, I yanked them open and staggered outside, gasping for air. But even as the sunlight hit my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That thing, whatever it was still inside, still waiting. I knew I wouldn't be able to escape it. The dark corner of the line had touched me, marked me, and I could already feel the shadows creeping in at the edges of my vision. It was only a matter of time before they came for me again. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. All I could do was stare at the walls of my apartment, the silence heavy, the darkness pressing in. The factory, that place, kept calling to me, a constant hum in the back of my mind, but I couldn't go back. Not after what I saw, not after the thing in the dark corner. But then, Richard called. His voice was low, strained, like he was on the edge of a breakdown. "You're not safe," he said, his words clipped. "You need to get out of there. The factory, it's not what you think. It's never been just a factory." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what had happened, but I couldn't get the words out. My mind was racing. The factory hadn't just been abandoned, it had been left for a reason. And it wasn't just old equipment and abandoned dreams. "I should have warned you," Richard continued, his voice trembling. "I never wanted anyone else to go in there. You're the last one. You need to leave now before it's too late." His voice broke on the last sentence, and the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand for what felt like hours, the weight of his words sinking in, but my body wouldn't move. Something wasn't right. I knew that now. I knew it the moment I stepped back inside. The factory was different. The doors, which had always creaked and groaned in protest when they opened, now swung wide with an unnatural ease. The air felt thick, wrong, alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped over the threshold, the cold seeping into my bones, and instantly I could feel it. It was here. The machines had stopped. The lights were still flickering in the same way they always had, but the factory was quieter. The oppressive hum that used to fill the space had gone. Now there was only the sound of breathing. Deep, guttural breaths, like something huge was moving within the walls. I knew it was waiting for me. I made my way down the hall toward the assembly line, my legs shaking with each step, but I couldn't stop. I had to see for myself. I had to understand. When I reached the line, I saw it. The thing. It was standing there, right in the middle of the factory floor, and it wasn't just one figure anymore. No, it was something far worse. It was a mass, a writhing, shifting mass of twisted metal and flesh, parts of machinery fused with human-like shapes, all mangled together in a grotesque, nightmarish form. There were limbs, too many limbs, dangling at odd angles, twisted pieces of mechanical arms and legs jutting out like they didn't belong. And its head, no, it wasn't a head. It was a mass of cables, wires, and black sludge, pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic beat. Two holes, empty and endless, stared back at me where its eyes should have been. It was the factory itself, and it wasn't. It was something that had been built here, constructed in secret, hidden away, forgotten. But it was never meant to exist. It was made of every machine that had ever been part of the factory, the pieces that had disappeared over the years, the parts that were never found, the gears, the belts, the metal sheets that should have been discarded. All of it had been used to create this thing. A twisted, unholy hybrid of man and machine. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't look away. The thing's head tilted slightly, as if noticing my presence, its empty sockets shifting to focus on me. The lights overhead flickered and buzzed, casting the scene in an erratic, unsettling glow. It knew I was there. Suddenly, the thing stirred, the metal limbs creaked, scraping against the floor as it moved, dragging its bloated body across the factory floor. The sound was maddening, the screech of twisted metal, the hiss of something alive inside the mechanical body. The factory groaned in response, as if the building itself was in pain. The thing let out a low, mechanical moan. It was talking, or trying to. The words were garbled, like a voice lost in static, but I could make out one word clearly: help. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the horror unfolding before me. The thing reached out with one of its twisted arms, its fingers stretching toward me, and as it did, I felt it. The pull, the force that came from the factory itself. I could feel the metal aching, stretching, as though it was trying to pull me in, trying to take me as part of its creation. Its voice, distorted and broken, filled the room again. Help me. I wanted to say something, anything, but I couldn't speak. It was as if the air had thickened, and no sound could escape my mouth. The thing's head jerked back and forth, its body jerking like it was malfunctioning, twitching in unnatural patterns. The thing wasn't alive in any true sense. It was a twisted mockery of life, created from pieces of the factory itself, leftovers, parts, the remnants of something that shouldn't have been. It was never meant to be built. It was a mistake, a monstrous thing created in the shadows, in the dark corners of the factory. And now it was awake. I took one step back, then another, and finally I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away. But even as I fled through the dark hallways, the sound of the thing's breathing, its slow, rhythmic gasps echoed behind me. The factory had been abandoned, but it had never been empty. It was waiting for me, and it was hungry. I don't know what made me go back. It's been abandoned for years, decades even, but still, something kept pulling me toward it. The old factory, its rusted walls, the jagged windows shattered by time, and the twisted iron fences that had once kept out intruders. Now broken, just like everything else. The place had been deserted since I was a child, yet it still stood, looming on the outskirts of town like a forgotten monument to something dark. At first, it was curiosity. I used to walk by it every day on my way home from school, but I never dared go inside. There were stories, of course. Ghosts of workers who had vanished without a trace, whispers of strange noises in the dead of night. People said it was haunted, that it was a place best left alone. I believed them, and I stayed away. But now, all these years later, the stories had changed. The factory had started calling to me. It was subtle at first, a fleeting thought that popped into my head, a whisper at the edge of my awareness. Go inside. I told myself it was just a passing fancy, that I was imagining things. But over time, the call grew louder. Every night, as I lay in bed, I would hear it. A distant, echoing sound. I couldn't quite make out the words, but it felt like the walls of the factory were speaking to me, beckoning me, urging me to come closer. One evening, after weeks of being haunted by this strange compulsion, I found myself standing in front of the factory's broken gate. The setting sun cast long shadows over the crumbling structure, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. My hands trembled as I gripped the gate's cold metal bars, feeling a shiver run down my spine. But I couldn't turn away. Something in me, some primal urge, kept me rooted to the spot. The factory was silent, its looming presence oppressive in the fading light. The doors, once wide open to the workers, were now sealed shut with rusted chains and padlocks. But even as I stared at the broken lock, I knew that it wouldn't be a barrier for long. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, but when I finally snapped out of my trance, I found myself walking toward the side of the building. The metal siding was covered in years of grime and weather-worn graffiti, the paint peeling off in patches. The back entrance, the one no one ever spoke of, was partially open, as if inviting me inside. The air felt heavier here, the atmosphere thick with something I couldn't quite place. It was like the factory itself was waiting, holding its breath, watching me approach. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped instantly, sending a cold shiver through my body. The once bustling factory floor was now a cavern of shadows, the faint light from the outside barely piercing through the grimy windows. The smell of old oil, metal, and something faintly rancid filled my nostrils as I walked deeper into the building. The floor was covered in dust and grime, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The factory should have been empty, it should have been abandoned, but it felt as though it was still alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked underfoot. Every sound in that place seemed amplified in the stillness. I froze. Had I heard something? I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. The factory, for all its dilapidation, felt strangely present. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, barely more than a breath, but it was there. A voice coming from deep within the bowels of the factory, calling to me. Come closer. My heart pounded. The voice seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls, swirling in the air like smoke. It was the same voice I had heard in my dreams, in my thoughts. The voice of the factory. I should have turned around and run. But instead, I stepped forward, drawn by the call. The factory was awake. It was calling me home. The factory's darkness swallowed me whole the moment I stepped inside. The once bright factory floor, filled with the steady hum of workers and machines, was now nothing but a hollow shell of its former self. But something had remained. Something that had never left. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, the air thick with something ancient and heavy. I wasn't sure why I kept going deeper into the building. I knew I should turn back. Whatever pull I'd felt to enter was clearly not normal. But the longer I stayed, the more the whispers seemed to wrap around me, urging me forward. I wasn't alone here. The hallways stretched out before me like a maze of rusted metal and broken concrete. The floor creaked with every step I took, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo in the silence. Every door I passed was shut tight, their rusty handles almost as if they were welded shut on purpose. But I had the distinct feeling that behind each one, something waited, something watched. I stopped in front of a door at the end of one hallway, a door that stood out from the others. It wasn't covered in rust or grime like the others. No. This door was pristine, almost as if it had been untouched by time. The wood was dark, glossy, as if it had just been installed yesterday, and the brass handle gleamed in the dim light. It felt wrong. The door should have been as neglected as the rest of the building, but it wasn't. It felt out of place. The whispers grew louder, urging me to open it. I reached out, my hand trembling, and gripped the cold handle. The moment I touched it, a shiver ran through me, as though the door had been waiting for me, calling me. Without thinking, I turned the handle and pushed. The door creaked open with an eerie slowness, the sound grinding against the silence. It opened into a room darker than the hallway, so dark that I couldn't even make out the edges of the walls. But I could feel something in that darkness, something alive, lurking just out of sight. I took a hesitant step inside, my breath shallow, and the door slammed shut behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I whirled around, but the room was pitch black. I was trapped. The only sound was the frantic thudding of my own heartbeat. Then the air shifted. I felt it before I saw it, something moving just outside the reach of the dim light spilling through the cracks in the doorframe. The shadows seemed to stir, creeping along the walls like living things. I strained my eyes, but I couldn't make out anything, just the crawling sensation that I was no longer alone. A whisper, low and raspy, filled the room. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It sounded distorted, like it was coming through water. "Leave now, before it's too late." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered back, panic clawing at my chest. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But that the door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the factory itself had sealed me in. The shadows twisted and writhed, and the whispering grew louder. A cacophony of voices now. There was something in the darkness, something just beyond the edge of my vision, something I wasn't meant to see. It felt like a presence, a force pushing against the walls, reaching out for me. The air grew colder, and I could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. My breath became visible, misting in front of me like smoke, but it wasn't the cold of the night. It was something else. Something unnatural. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, coiling like serpents, their movements synchronized, as if they were alive, feeding off my fear. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just the dark playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things. But when I opened them again, I saw it, a shape, a figure, barely a silhouette in the darkness. Tall, thin, and distorted, it stood motionless at the far side of the room. Its limbs were too long, too angular, and its head was twisted at an impossible angle, as if it was staring at me from behind its own neck. I froze. My blood ran cold. And then it moved. It wasn't a step, not a shuffle. No, it was a glide. It moved without a sound, its body shifting unnaturally, flowing across the room like liquid in a way no human being could. The thing didn't walk, it hovered, and as it drew closer I could see it more clearly. Its skin was slick and black, covered in a sheen of what I could only describe as slime. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing slits where eyes should have been. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. But I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The whispers came faster now, overlapping each other, a chorus of voices pleading with me, begging me to leave. But I couldn't move. The thing in front of me was getting closer, its empty eyes fixed on me, and I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. "You shouldn't have come," the whisper came again, now directly in my ear, its breath cold and wet against my skin. I wanted to answer. I wanted to scream at it, but my voice was gone. I couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there, watching it move toward me, its body a shifting mass of shadows and slime. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. 1 second it was there, looming in front of me, and the next, nothing. The room fell silent. The shadows receded, leaving only the dim light from the cracked door. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, the air thick with the taste of fear. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, desperately pulling at the door handle. It gave way this time, the door swinging open with a creak, and I was free. I ran, not looking back, not daring to glance over my shoulder as I stumbled down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as I escaped the room, I knew the thing wasn't gone. It was still in there, still waiting in the darkness, behind closed doors. I thought I'd escaped. I thought that if I left that room, that dark corner of the factory, I could shake off whatever malevolent force had been stalking me. But the factory wasn't finished with me. It had no intention of letting me go that easily. The further I walked down the hall, the more the sense of unease grew. The air felt heavier, thick with something unseen, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. The factory had been silent for so long, its machines idle and broken, but I could feel them alive now, aware. And it wasn't just the machinery that was stirring. I started hearing it again. That whispering, low, guttural, and muffled, like 1,000 voices trapped somewhere beneath the factory floor. At first I thought it was my imagination, some twisted echo of fear playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't just in my head. They were real. I followed the sound, drawn to it like a moth to a flame, despite every rational instinct telling me to turn back. The sound led me deeper into the bowels of the factory, toward a network of old pipes and ventilation shafts. I had never noticed them before. How had I missed them? They crisscrossed the factory like veins, disappearing into the walls, rising and falling like a twisted maze of metal and rust. I hesitated at the entrance to the pipe room. The walls were slick with years of grime, and the floor was covered in pools of stagnant water, the smell of mold and decay hanging in the air. But the voices, they were coming from here. The pipes hissed and groaned, vibrating with some unseen force. There was something deep inside them, something that wanted to speak. I stepped forward, my breath shallow as I crept closer. The pipes ran in all directions, snaking into the walls and disappearing into the darkness. I could hear the voices now, clear and distinct, like distant murmurs, as though they were trapped inside the very pipes themselves. Help? It was faint, but it was there. A soft plea, barely a whisper, but it sent a shiver up my spine. It sounded desperate. I couldn't understand the words completely, but I could feel the terror in the voice. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a cry for release. Whatever had been trapped inside these pipes, it wanted out. I knelt beside one of the larger pipes, my heart racing as I listened more closely. The sound was clearer now, but still distorted, muffled by the metal walls of the pipe. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus. A dozen, maybe more, all speaking in different tones, overlapping each other, pleading with me. Free us. It hurts. We're trapped. My stomach turned as I realized what they were. People. Or something that used to be people. These were voices of the workers who had disappeared over the years. The ones who had been forgotten, their fates lost to the factory's depths. They hadn't just vanished. They had been consumed by the factory, sucked into its bowels, trapped within the very walls, the pipes, the machinery. But why? Why had they been taken? And what had become of them? I couldn't stop myself. The need to know, to understand, was overwhelming. I moved closer to the pipe, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The voices in the pipes grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew I was listening, as if they could feel me reaching toward them. Please, find us. I grabbed the nearest wrench, my hands shaking, and pried at the bolts of the pipe. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the room, mingling with the voices, making my head spin. The air grew thicker with each passing second, more as though the factory itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. With a final wrench, I loosened the bolt. The moment the seal broke, a sudden rush of cold air shot out from inside the pipe, and I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The voices stopped, cut off as if something had silenced them. I stared at the now open pipe, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the whispering started again, louder this time, more urgent. But it wasn't coming from the pipe anymore. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the rusted pipes and the water pooling at my feet. But the air, it felt different. The voices weren't confined to the pipes anymore. They were all around me, swirling through the room, filling the air with a chorus of tortured souls. You shouldn't have opened it. I froze. That voice was different from the others. It wasn't pleading, it was accusing. I looked around, but the room was still empty. The pipes hissed and groaned as if alive, but the voices were no longer coming from them. They were coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the factory. You released us, now you'll pay. Suddenly, I heard it, a loud crack, followed by the sound of metal snapping and grinding. I turned to see one of the pipes shifting, bending under some unseen pressure. The metal twisted, stretching like it was alive, as if it had a mind of its own. And then, from the open pipe I had loosened, a hand emerged, pale, thin, and covered in slick black sludge. I stepped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hand reached out further, followed by another, and then an entire arm. The thing inside the pipe wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something twisted and wrong, crawling out of the factory's depths, taking form piece by piece. The voice came again, a guttural rasp. You freed us. Now you'll join us. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me. I had to run. I had to get out of there before whatever had been released from the pipes consumed me too. But I couldn't run fast enough. The thing lurched forward, its skeletal hand gripping the edge of the pipe, pulling itself free, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just one. There were more. More hands, more limbs emerging from the pipes, twisting and writhing as they reached for me. Their fingers long and sharp, their bodies covered in thick, black sludge. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the pipe room. My mind was in a haze, panic pulsing through my veins, and my legs moved on autopilot. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was run. The thing in the pipes. It wasn't human. It had never been human. It was something ancient, something that had been sleeping beneath the factory for years, waiting for a fool like me to open the door, to break the seal. And I had awakened it. As I ran, the factory seemed to shift around me. The hallways twisted, the walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with the scent of rust and decay. The voices were everywhere now, all around me, like whispers in the walls, in the floors, in the very air. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from. It felt like the whole factory was alive, its walls pulsing with some kind of dark energy, as if it were feeding on my fear. I stumbled into a wide room, the factory's main floor, but it wasn't what I expected. It was different. The machinery was gone, the floor cracked and broken, and the ceiling sagged as though it had been abandoned for centuries. But there, in the center of the room, something was moving. At first I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. There was a tremor in the ground beneath me, a low, rumbling sound, like the factory itself was groaning in pain. Then, the floor beneath my feet cracked, splintered, and split wide open. I fell to my knees, my breath catching in my throat. The hole in the floor was wide now, dark and endless, a yawning chasm that seemed to go down forever. From deep within that darkness, something stirred. It wasn't a voice this time. No, it was something worse. A low, guttural growl, like the growl of an animal too deep to be real, too powerful to exist in any world I knew. I watched in horror as something began to rise from the depths of the floor. It wasn't like the thing from the pipes, which had been humanoid in shape, if twisted and wrong. No, this thing was something else, something monstrous. At first, I couldn't make it out completely, but then the shadows around it seemed to recoil, pulling back as though afraid of it. And that's when I saw it. It was massive, a writhing mass of black, slick tendrils that stretched out from the darkness beneath the floor, twisting and undulating like a living organism. The tendrils reached out, slithering toward me, their tips sharp and jagged like broken glass. They seemed to feel the air, sensing my presence, and then they snapped toward me with terrifying speed. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing in the floor was impossibly large, bigger than anything I could have imagined. And it wasn't just one creature. It was a mass, an entity made of 1,000 writhing parts, shifting and moving, like a nightmare made flesh. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was inside it. What it had become. The tendrils were wrapped around something. Human shapes, bodies twisted and mangled, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They weren't alive, not anymore. They were part of the thing. The factory had taken them, twisted them into this abomination. Their limbs were fused with the mass, their eyes wide open in an eternal scream. And it was hungry. I backed away, my hands shaking as I tried to think, tried to move, but my legs were like stone. The thing in the floor gave another low growl, and the bodies inside it shifted, as if they were waking up, reaching out for me. The tendrils moved faster now, lunging toward me with horrific precision. I ran, I didn't think, I just ran, but I could feel it chasing me. I could feel it closing in. The floor beneath me shaking with each of its movements. The factory was alive, every inch of it, and it wasn't just pulling me toward that thing beneath the floor, it was pulling me into it. I sprinted toward the exit, but as I reached the doors, they slammed shut in front of me. I yanked on the handles, but the doors wouldn't open. The walls around me began to shake violently, and I could hear the thing behind me. Its tendrils slithering closer, the growls growing louder. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The factory had me. You belong to us now. The whisper came again, the voice distorted and warped, as if coming from deep within the floor, from deep within the factory's very foundation. And then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The black mass, the writhing tendrils, emerging from the cracks in the floor. It was reaching for me. It was coming for me. I turned and ran once more, but this time I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. There was no leaving. The factory would keep me. It would take me, just like it had taken all the others. And just like them, I would become part of the thing beneath the floor. I screamed as the tendrils coiled around my legs, dragging me back toward the darkness. the thing that had been waiting for me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that this was how it had always been. The factory never let go. And now, neither would I. I never should have been in there. I know that now. I know that I should have listened to the warnings, the whispers of the workers who had long since abandoned this place. But back then, when I first entered the factory, the allure of forgotten spaces, of hidden secrets, was too strong. I thought it was just an old, dilapidated building, one of those relics from the past, abandoned and left to rot. How wrong I was. It was my first day on the job, and I had been given a simple task: inventory the forgotten parts and scrap metal scattered throughout the facility. I was instructed to avoid the lower floors and to steer clear of the unapproved rooms, as they put it. I didn't think much of it. After all, this was just a place for old machinery. Who cared what was buried down in the bowels of the factory? But curiosity has a way of gnawing at you, especially when it's your first time alone in a place like this. And there was something about the door at the end of the hallway that called to me. It wasn't locked, not really. It had a rusted old padlock hanging loosely on the side, but it wasn't secured. The lock was more like a symbol, something meant to deter you, but with the faintest possibility that someone might open it. The door itself was made of heavy, stained wood, and it felt like it had been there for ages, untouched by time or the people who had worked here. When I pushed it open, the hinges let out a groan that sent a chill through me. It was pitch black inside, the kind of darkness that presses against your skin. I couldn't see a thing. A part of me wanted to turn back, to lock the door behind me and forget about whatever was in there. But the curiosity was stronger. It was so strong, I could taste it. I reached for the flashlight in my pocket and clicked it on, the beam of light slicing through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the room was a machine, a massive, hulking thing that shouldn't have been there. It was old, covered in rust and grime, but it wasn't just any piece of machinery. It was a contraption. There were tubes, pipes, and gears, twisted together in a way that seemed wrong. Its shape was too complex, too organic, as if someone had designed it without any care for the laws of physics or logic. But what caught my attention was the noise, the hum. It was subtle at first, just a soft vibration in the air. I thought it was a malfunctioning piece of equipment, but when I focused on it, I realized the sound was coming from the machine itself. It was alive, or at least it felt that way. The hum seemed to reverberate through the room, through the very walls, like it was coming from the core of the earth. It didn't stop. It never stopped. I couldn't understand it. This room, this machine, shouldn't have been here. It wasn't on any blueprints I'd seen, nor did anyone mention it during the tour. And yet, it was alive. It had a presence. I stepped into the room, my feet heavy against the floor, and the moment I did, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped. A chill ran up my spine, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. But then my eyes were drawn to something else. A screen on the far wall, flickering erratically, though there was no obvious power source. A line of old buttons and switches sat beside it, the labels worn away by time, the edges of the buttons faded and cracked. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor, and something inside me told me that I needed to touch those buttons. I shouldn't have. I should have backed out, locked the door, and pretended like I never found this place. But the pull was irresistible. I reached forward, and the moment my fingers brushed the surface of the first button, the entire room seemed to lurch forward. The hum intensified, a low, mechanical growl that made my teeth rattle. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The machine responded, the pipes groaned, and the floor shook beneath me as if the entire factory was waking up from a long, unnatural slumber. And that's when I heard it. A voice. A whisper, low and rasping, almost lost beneath the humming. You should not have come here. The voice wasn't human, at least not anymore. It was distorted, muffled, like it was coming from the depths of the machine itself, or maybe from the very walls surrounding me. It was an inhuman, guttural sound that vibrated through my chest, sending a cold shiver down my spine. You should never have opened it. I froze, my mind racing. What was happening? Why was I hearing this? And why did I feel as though this machine was speaking directly to me? I backed up, but the door slammed shut behind me, with a force that made the entire room shake. The air grew thick, heavy, like I was trapped inside some kind of prison. The voice continued, a chorus now, as if it were coming from the depths of the machine, and from the walls, from the pipes, from everywhere. You are ours now, you have awakened it. I turned to the machine. Alive. The metal skin of the machine seemed to ripple with unseen energy, sending out waves of vibration that made the floor beneath me tremble. The humming grew louder, almost deafening. You shouldn't have woken it, the voice whispered again, more distinct this time, as if the machine itself was speaking to me, as if it had always been aware of my presence. I didn't know if the voice was real, or if I was simply losing my grip on reality. The sound was so deep, so ingrained in the very air, that it felt like the hum had always been here. Buried deep in the factory, waiting for me to come. Waiting for someone to come. I staggered back, my mind racing, but the door wouldn't budge. I hammered my fists against the wood, but it was like punching concrete. The factory had sealed me in. There was no escape. The hum grew louder still, but now it seemed to echo in my head, reverberating through my skull. It was a sound that went beyond the physical. A sound that seemed to reach into something deeper, a place where thoughts and memories collided. And then the room changed. The walls, once solid and rusted, began to shift, contorting like liquid metal. The pipes in the corners of the room writhed, curling and twisting as though they were coming to life, pulling the room into a new shape. I staggered forward, my hand reaching for one of the exposed pipes, but as I touched it, a shock of cold energy surged through me. My fingers burned and my vision blurred. I pulled back, gasping for air, but it was no use. The room had shifted again, and I was no longer standing in the factory I had entered. I was somewhere else in time. The change was subtle at first. The walls faded, replaced by a vast expanse of steel and machinery, but the hum remained, now more distant and muffled. I could hear faint voices, like whispers on the wind, voices that sounded old, ancient, as though they had been trapped in time itself. The hum echoed through the years like the heartbeat of a long-dead thing, reverberating through the corridors of time. I felt the pull of it, dragging me deeper, pulling me through moments I didn't understand. I was standing in the middle of a factory floor, not the one I had entered, but a different one. It was pristine, new, untouched by time or decay. The machines were humming with purpose, but the sound was different. It was cleaner, more controlled. It was the sound of industry at its peak, at its beginning. I could see men and women, their faces ghostly pale in the artificial light, working tirelessly at their stations. Their eyes were empty, focused only on the machines before them. Their movements mechanical, as though they were a part of the factory itself. I wanted to speak, to scream, to warn them, but the words wouldn't come. I was nothing more than a phantom watching a scene that had already happened. I could feel the weight of it, the suffocating pressure of time pressing down on me. I was standing in the past, but it wasn't my past. It was a past that belonged to the factory. Then I saw it. At the center of the room, a massive machine stood. It was identical to the one in the locked room, the one that I had woken. The pipes stretched out like a spider's web, twisting into the ceiling, disappearing into the shadows. And above the machine, a small control panel blinked with dim lights, casting an eerie glow across the workers. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. This machine had been the beginning of everything. The heartbeat that had fueled the factory's creation, the thing that had set it into motion. But what was it really? I reached forward, my hand trembling as I neared the machine. The hum grew louder, drowning out all other sound. But now it wasn't just the hum I heard. There were other sounds, buried beneath it. The sounds of metal scraping against metal, the faintest echo of a scream. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't piece it together. And then in that moment, the workers stopped. All at once, they turned toward me. Their eyes were vacant, lifeless, but they were looking at me, as though they knew I was there, as though they had always known. "You have awakened it," one of them said, their voice hollow and distorted, as though they were speaking through the machine itself. "You have set it free." The words echoed in my mind, crashing through the walls of the factory. But they weren't just words, they were a warning. Something had been released. The hum was no longer a background noise. It was growing, intensifying, and I realized with a sickening lurch that I wasn't in the past anymore. I was back in the factory I had entered, but the machine was still there, waiting. The walls had stopped shifting, but the presence of the hum remained, just as it had before. Only now, it was louder, closer, as if it had followed me back from wherever I had just been. And I knew with sudden clarity that the hum, the machine, it had never stopped. It had only been waiting for someone to come, someone to unlock the door. And now it would never let me go. I've stopped counting the hours. Maybe it's been days, maybe weeks. Time seems to stretch and contract in this place, and I'm losing track of what's real and what isn't. But one thing is certain, the machine never stops. It hums, it thrums, it vibrates through the very bones of the factory, and I can't seem to escape it. Every step I take feels heavier, like the air itself is pressing in on me, pushing me deeper into this maze of rust and decay. I thought I was alone. For a while, it felt like I was the factory's walls closing in around me, the humming filling my mind to the point where I could almost feel it in my teeth. But then I began to hear it again. At first, I chalked it up to the machine itself. Maybe it was malfunctioning. Maybe I was just hearing things. But when I stopped and really listened, I realized I wasn't alone in this room anymore. There was something else. Something. Watching. It's not the machine. It's not the hum. It's something else. Something silent. I didn't notice it at first, but now I feel it every time I turn my head. It's subtle, an almost imperceptible shift in the shadows. It's there in the corner of my vision, lurking just out of reach. It's as though the factory itself has grown a consciousness, a mind that has been here longer than the machines, longer than the workers, maybe even longer than the building itself. And whatever it is, it's been watching me ever since I opened that door. It doesn't make a sound. It doesn't move. But it's there. I keep checking the corners, the rafters, the space behind the machines. There's nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. But I know it's there. The oppressive feeling of being watched never goes away. The silence is deafening. I've tried to rationalize it, tell myself it's just my nerves, the isolation, the haunting hum that's been reverberating through the walls. But the longer I stay here, the more the weight of that presence grows. I know I'm not imagining it. The machine isn't the only thing that never stops in this place. There's something else, something ancient, that has been here far longer than the factory ever was. And it knows me. It knows I've come. The first time I truly felt it, I was standing near the machine, the buzzing sound surrounding me like a blanket. I wasn't touching it, but I could feel its presence. Alive, humming with a force I couldn't explain. I was staring at the control panel again, its flashing lights beckoning when I caught someone, out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was a shadow, maybe a trick of the light. But when I turned fully to face it, the shadow didn't move. It was just standing there in the darkness, perfectly still. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My heart began to pound. I took a step toward it, trying to shake the feeling of dread that washed over me. The shadow remained unmoving, but as I stepped closer, I realized that it wasn't just a shadow. It was a shape, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still in the darkness. It didn't have a face. It was like looking at a silhouette against the factory's grime-riddled walls. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, but I could feel it watching me. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it, but the moment stretched, pulling everything around me into a quiet, suffocating void. The hum of the machine never stopped, but it seemed to fade into the background, becoming distant, unimportant. All that mattered was the figure in the shadows. I blinked. It was gone. No sound, no movement. It simply wasn't there anymore. I looked around in a panic, my pulse racing, but there was nothing. No shadow, no figure. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I know it was real. I know it was watching me. Since then, it's happened again. In the corners of the room, just out of sight, the figure is there, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes I think I hear it move, but when I turn, it's always gone. The presence never leaves. It's not just a trick of the light or my mind playing games. Whatever it is, it's tied to this place, to the factory, to the machine. I've tried to leave. There's no way out. The factory doesn't want me to leave. The walls close in around me every time I try to find an exit, every time I think I've found a way out. The hallways twist back into the heart of the factory. The machines hum louder. The shadows grow darker. And I can feel it there with me, always just behind me, always watching. The more I stare at the machine, the more I see it. The thing inside, the thing that's alive, the one that was awakened when I touched the buttons. The one that never stopped, that feeds on whatever has been trapped here in the darkness. I'm beginning to realize that the machine is not just a machine. It's a vessel, an ancient, forgotten thing that doesn't just hum, it watches. It knows. And the figure in the shadows is its silent watcher. It is part of it. It is watching me, waiting for the moment when I will understand. But I don't think I ever will. Not fully. The machine has been here for longer than I can comprehend, longer than I have time to figure out. And it is patient. It has been waiting for a moment like this, waiting for someone to unlock the door, to wake it up, to feed it. And I think I am the one it's been waiting for. The silent watcher knows it too. It knows what's coming, and it knows I'm already too far gone. I've spent what feels like an eternity in this place. The factory is no longer just a building to me. It's a maze, a prison, and I am its unwilling occupant. The hum never stops. It's always there, vibrating through my body, resonating in my skull. It's as though the machine is a living, breathing thing, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. And then, I saw it. I had thought about it for days, weeks, maybe. The control panel, the buttons, the very things that had started this, waking the machine from its slumber. I had no idea what they did, but something told me that turning it off, stopping the hum, would be the key to ending this nightmare. I've always been a practical person. When faced with a problem, I look for the solution. I analyze it, break it down. But now, in this factory, I've learned the hard way that not every problem can be solved with logic. Some things can't be fixed. Some things shouldn't be touched. The moment I laid my hands on the panel again, the hum intensified, buzzing louder than before. My fingers trembled, the weight of the decision pressing on me. I had already felt the consequences of turning the machine on. But the idea of leaving it running, knowing what it could do, what it had already done, was unbearable. So I reached for the largest switch, the one that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I hesitated. For a moment, I thought I heard the machine speak again. Not with a voice, not with words, but with an urge. A tug at the back of my mind, a warning. The hum grew deeper, darker, like it was trying to lure me in, to prevent me from making the decision. It knew what would happen if I flipped that switch. It knew the price of turning it off. But I couldn't back down now. The factory had already consumed so much of my time, my sanity. I had to do something. I had to end it. I pulled the lever. At first, nothing happened. The hum didn't stop. The walls didn't collapse. The floor didn't open up beneath me. I was caught in that fleeting moment of hope, where I thought I had finally won, finally stopped the madness. But then it came. A sharp, searing pain shot through my chest, like a bolt of electricity tearing through my veins. I screamed, my breath ragged, my vision blurring. The factory walls around me twisted, as if the very air was being sucked into the machine's core. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and in that moment, I realized this was the price. This wasn't just about turning off the machine. It wasn't about fixing it. The machine wasn't something that could be controlled. It wasn't something that could simply be stopped. It was alive. It had always been alive. It had been waiting for me to make this mistake, to think that I could turn it off like a light switch. I staggered back from the control panel, my body racked with pain. The floor beneath me heaved as though it were a living thing, shifting and twisting in response to the machine's awakening. The walls groaned, and the lights above flickered as if struggling to stay on. But it was the sound that tore through my skull, that made me realize the full extent of the price I had just paid. The machine wasn't just a machine. It was a trap. And I had just triggered it. The moment I turned the switch, the hum didn't stop. It only grew louder, deeper, as though the machine was reacting to my defiance, to my desire to shut it down. The ground beneath me shuddered as the factory itself seemed to come alive. The pipes that had once been still now writhed and twisted, stretching like veins beneath the factory floor. The walls began to buckle, and I could hear the low, tortured groans of the machinery as if it were crying out in agony. And then I saw it. A figure, dark and shifting, emerged from the shadows. It was taller than a man, impossibly tall, and its body was not made of flesh and bone. It was made of the very machinery that powered this place, the pipes, the wires, the gears, twisted together in some grotesque living amalgamation of metal and flesh. Its eyes, or what could have been eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, cold and calculating. It moved toward me. It stepped silent on the factory floor, but I could feel its presence as it approached. I stumbled backward, my breath quickening, but it didn't stop. It wasn't moving to attack me, but to watch. It knew what I had done. It was waiting for me to understand the true cost of my actions. "You shouldn't have done that," the voice came again, not from the machine this time, but from the figure itself. Its voice was mechanical, hollow, like it was speaking through the very machine I had tried to stop. "Now, you must pay." I could feel the weight of its words, and it was then that I understood. This machine, this factory, wasn't just a collection of gears and metal. It was a prison. A prison for something that should never have been created, something that should never have existed. The factory had been built to house it, to keep it locked away, buried beneath layers of metal and time. But I had broken the seal, I had woken it, and now it wanted its price. I could feel the machine tightening around me, the walls pressing in, as though the factory itself were closing its grip on me. The figure took another step forward, and I felt something cold press against my chest. My breath caught in my throat as the pressure increased, squeezing the air from my lungs. "You're part of it now," it whispered, its voice like the grinding of metal. "You will never leave. You will never be free. The price of turning it off is more than you can pay." The walls screamed as the factory tightened its grip, and I realized with sickening clarity there was no way out, not anymore. The hum had never stopped. It had only been waiting for me to turn the switch. And now it had me. I was part of the machine now. Forever. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has no meaning in this place. The only thing that tells me whether it's day or night is the faint light that filters through the cracked windows, but even that doesn't feel real anymore. This factory, the one I found myself in, isn't like the others I've seen. It's different. More alive somehow. It's as if the very walls are breathing, watching, waiting. I came here on a whim, drawn by a rumor, some offhand comment about an old factory on the edge of town, abandoned for decades, but still echoing with the ghosts of its past. I thought it would be a quick thrill, a story to tell, something to add to the list of places I visited. But now, standing in the middle of the factory floor, surrounded by nothing but rust and dust, I realize how foolish I was. The place is silent, but it's not a peaceful silence. It's the kind of silence that hangs thick in the air, pressing against your chest, making it hard to breathe. The factory floor stretches out before me, empty except for the skeletal remains of old machines. The machines that once hummed and whirred, turning raw materials into something useful. Now they sit like tombstones, abandoned and forgotten. I step cautiously forward, the sound of my boots echoing through the cavernous space. The factory is massive, far bigger than I expected, and yet there's no sign of life. No workers, no movement, not even the occasional rat scurrying across the floor. It's as if the place has been frozen in time. I walk past a row of machines, each one more decrepit than the last. The rust is thick on their surfaces, and the once shiny metal is now dull and pitted. Some of them have broken gears, others are missing parts entirely, but they all share one thing in common: they are still. The stillness of them is unnerving, as though they are waiting for something. Something that only the factory knows. I keep moving, my footsteps slow and deliberate, as though I don't want to disturb the silence that surrounds me. But then I hear it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, just a rustle, a whisper, like fabric brushing against skin. I stop dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath catches in my throat as I strain to listen, but the sound is gone as quickly as it came. For a moment, I think I imagined it. The silence in the factory is so oppressive, my mind is playing tricks on me. But then I hear it again. A faint whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing, like a voice calling out from the shadows. I turn, instinctively looking for the source, but the factory is as empty as before. There's nothing here. Only the machines, the dust, and the walls that seem to stretch on forever. I take a step forward, my nerves frayed, and that's when I hear it more clearly. This time, a soft voice just behind me. Turn back. I spin around, my heart racing, but there's no one there. The factory floor is still empty. The shadows long and dark in the corners, as though nothing has moved since the day it was abandoned. But the voice, it felt real. Like someone had whispered it directly into my ear. I swallow hard, my throat dry, and take a few cautious steps back. Something is wrong here. I'm not sure what, but I can feel it in my gut. There's a presence in this place, something ancient, something that has been waiting. I shake my head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but the whispering voice lingers in my mind. It's as though the factory is alive, not with people, but with something else. Something that remembers. I look around, trying to make sense of what's happening, and that's when I see it. The floor in the center of the factory is different. The concrete is cracked, uneven, but it's not the same as the rest of the factory. It's as if it's been disturbed. I approach cautiously, my eyes narrowing as I try to make sense of the marks in the floor. It's a strange pattern, long, winding lines that cut through the dust and dirt, like someone, or something, has been dragging something heavy across the floor. The marks lead to a door in the far corner of the factory, one that I hadn't noticed before. It's small, almost hidden by the shadows, and the handle is covered in rust. The whispering voice seems to come from that direction, though I can't be sure. The silence that had once been all-encompassing is now punctuated by the faintest sounds. A scrape, a shuffle, the creaking of old wood. The factory feels different now, more alive, more aware of my presence. Against every instinct in my body, I move toward the door. The air feels colder the closer I get, like the temperature is dropping by the second. And then, as I reach the door, I hear the voice again, clearer now, almost pleading. Don't open it. I hesitate, my hand inches away from the rusted handle. I don't know who or what is trying to warn me, but something inside me tells me to turn back, to leave, to walk away from this place before it's too late. But I can't. Something is drawing me in. Something is calling me. With a shaking hand, I turn the handle, and the factory answers. The door creaks open, its ancient hinges groaning in protest, and a rush of cold air sweeps over me. It's a stark contrast to the stagnant warmth of the factory floor, and for a moment, I stand there, frozen in place. My breath fogs in front of me, dissipating quickly as I peer into the darkness beyond the threshold. The room is pitch black, so dark that even the dim light from the factory floor can't reach it. The shadows feel thicker here, as if they are waiting to consume me. The whisper, that same soft voice, comes again, this time clearer, more distinct. You shouldn't have opened it. I shiver, the words cutting through the stillness like a blade. I don't know where the voice is coming from. There's no one here. No one that I can see. The factory, the room, the silence, they all seem to conspire against me, closing in, making everything feel unnatural. But still, despite the warning, despite the cold dread creeping up my spine, I step forward. My feet feel like lead, as though the very floor beneath me is resisting my movement, but I force myself to walk into the darkness. I squint, trying to adjust my eyes, but the blackness is overwhelming. It's as if the light itself is being sucked away, swallowed by the emptiness. I can hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged in the silence, but that's the only sound. No rats, no distant hum of machines, not even the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. It's as if the entire space is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, it comes again, the whisper. It's not supposed to be opened. This time it's closer. I feel it, like a presence at the edge of my hearing, just to the right of me, but when I turn, there's nothing there. No figure, no shadow, nothing to explain the sound. But the words are real, too real, and they burrow into my mind, digging deep into something primal, something that tells me I'm in the wrong place, that I've disturbed something that should have been left alone. I take a few more steps into the room, each movement a battle against the growing tension in my chest. The air grows colder, if that's even possible. It feels like the temperature is dropping by the second, as though the room itself is trying to freeze me in place. My teeth chatter, and I wrap my arms around myself, trying to stave off the bone-deep chill. The walls of the room are bare. No windows, no furniture, nothing but an emptiness that seems to stretch on forever. There's a strange smell in the air, too. It's faint but unmistakable. A mix of rust and something else, something foul. It hangs in the air, clinging to my skin and filling my nostrils. It smells like decay, like the earth itself is rotting. And then, just when I think I can't take it anymore, I hear it. A faint, rasping sound, like something scraping against metal. It's coming from the far side of the room, where the darkness seems to grow deeper, as if it's swallowing the light. I hold my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. My instincts scream at me to turn around, to run, to get out of this place before whatever it is makes itself known. But my legs won't move. They feel like they're made of stone, rooted to the spot. The scraping sound gets louder, more frantic, as though something is dragging itself across the floor, something heavy and slow. I take a tentative step forward, the floor creaking under my weight, but the sound stops. I freeze. For a moment, everything is silent again, but the silence feels different now. It's not empty. It's suffocating. It's as if the darkness has taken on a life of its own, pressing in from all sides. I turn my head slowly, scanning the room, but there's nothing. The shadows stretch unnaturally, like they're reaching for me, and the cold presses tighter against my skin. And then from somewhere within the dark, I hear it. The voice. Turn around. I don't know how I hear it, but I do. It's not a whisper this time, it's a command, a demand. It sends a chill down my spine, freezing me in place, and against every fiber of my being, against every warning in my head, I slowly turn. The darkness behind me shifts. At first, it's subtle, just a slight movement, a ripple in the air, like the shadows are alive, moving of their own accord. But then I see it. A figure, just at the edge of the darkness. It's tall, impossibly tall, and its outline is distorted, like it's made of smoke, like it's not quite real. It flickers, vanishing and reappearing, and with each blink of my eyes, it grows closer. I can't move. I can't breathe. My legs are frozen in place, and all I can do is stare at it, unable to tear my eyes away. It's not human. It doesn't have a face, at least not one that I can see. Its form is jagged, like it was constructed from the shadows themselves, and there's something unnatural about it, something that doesn't belong in this world. It shifts, like it's watching me, waiting for me to react. The voice comes again, clearer now, closer. Leave this place. I can't. I want to, but my body refuses to move. It's as though the factory, the room, the shadows, they're all holding me captive. The figure steps forward and I feel its presence, pressing against me like a weight, suffocating and heavy. And then a sound, this time not a whisper, but a cry. A hollow, wrenching sound, as though something is trapped in the depths of the shadows, calling out for release. I can't tell where it's coming from. I can't tell what it is. But the sound cuts through the stillness, sharp and desperate, like a scream from another time. The figure is closer now. It's right there. I feel its presence in the pit of my stomach, in the core of my soul, as if it's reaching out to me, pulling me in. I know in that moment that I've made a terrible mistake. The factory, this place, isn't empty. It's never been empty. The voices, the whispers, the shadows, they've always been here, waiting, and I can't escape them. Not now, not ever. I don't know how long I've been standing there, staring at the shadowy figure that seems to devour the very light around it. Time has ceased to exist in this place. There's only the presence of that thing looming in the darkness, and the eerie silence that presses down on me like a suffocating blanket. It's as though the factory itself is holding its breath, waiting for something, and I can't help but feel like I'm the one who's being watched. The figure doesn't move, at least not any way I can see. It remains a vague, flickering outline, shifting between the darkness and the shadows, as if it's not quite sure whether it wants to be seen or remain hidden. But its presence is undeniable. It's in the way the air feels heavier, the way the temperature continues to drop, the way the very ground beneath my feet seems to be pulling me down into the depths of something I can't comprehend. The whispering voice continues to echo in my mind, each word a thread that weaves itself into the very fabric of my thoughts, like it's trying to tear me apart from the inside. Leave this place. You shouldn't be here. I should leave. I know that. Every ounce of my being is screaming at me to turn and run, to escape before whatever it is consumes me. But my legs refuse to obey. I am rooted to the spot, as though the factory itself has a hold on me, as though the shadows are pulling me in. The room around me seems to grow colder still, the silence stretching on, thickening the air until it's hard to breathe. It's as if the sound is being drained from the world itself, and all that's left is the oppressive weight of nothing. There are no footsteps, no whispers, no creaks in the floor, only the silence. The air itself feels like it's closing in on me. I take a shaky step backward, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts, but the floor beneath me shifts. It's subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but then the vibrations grow stronger, and the ground seems to undulate, like it's alive. The whispering voice returns, louder now, more insistent. Don't go any further. Turn back. I look around frantically, but there's nowhere to go. No way out. The door I came through, the one that led into this room, has vanished. Or maybe it was never there to begin with. All I see is a wall of darkness, stretching into infinity. It's as though the room itself has shifted, reshaped itself in some unnatural way, trapping me in this place. The shadows seem to close in around me, thick and suffocating. I take another step backward, my heart pounding in my chest, but it's useless. The space around me is growing smaller, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The cold is unbearable now, seeping into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. And then I hear it. A low, guttural growl, so faint at first I almost think it's my imagination. But it's not. The sound comes again, louder this time, reverberating through the floor and into my bones. It's the sound of something alive, something that shouldn't be here, something that's been waiting for me. The figure in the shadows stirs. It's closer now. I don't know how, but it's right there, just behind me, its presence like a weight pressing against my back. I feel its cold, its emptiness, and I know that it's not just watching me. It's waiting. The whispering voice, now joined by a chorus of others, fills my mind, a cacophony of words I can't make sense of. It's like 100 voices speaking at once, each one more desperate than the last. Leave now. You don't belong here. The silence is all you'll ever know. I stumble forward, my legs finally obeying my desperate will, but the darkness isn't done with me. The ground shifts beneath my feet again, and suddenly the room tilts, as though the very floor is buckling, tilting me toward the center of some invisible abyss. The walls groan as if they're being pulled inward, and I can hear the deep, rattling sound of metal creaking under pressure. I try to scream, to shout, to beg for help, but no sound escapes my lips. It's as though the factory has swallowed my voice, devoured it whole, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The shadows are closing in on me. They're wrapping around my legs, my arms, my throat. I feel them pull me, tugging me toward the center of the room, toward something dark, something that's waiting in the depths of the silence. And then I feel it. A pressure on my chest, as if the darkness itself is trying to crush the air out of my lungs. The shadows are suffocating me, dragging me down into their depths. I can't breathe. I can't move. All I can do is feel the weight of the silence, heavy and relentless, crushing everything inside me. The figure in the shadows steps closer. I can feel it, right there, its presence almost tangible, like it's pressing against my skin. I can hear its movements, slow, deliberate, like it's savoring every moment. The whispering voices have stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum, like the sound of something ancient waking up, something that's been waiting for this moment. You are a part of this now. The words hit me like a slap, and I realize, with horror, that they are not just a warning. They are a truth. I've crossed a line. I've entered something that I can't escape. The factory, the darkness, the shadows, they are all part of it now, and I am part of them. The room continues to collapse inward, and I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that the factory isn't just a place. It's a prison. A prison made of silence and shadows, and I've wandered too far into its heart, and there is no way out. I am trapped. I don't know when the darkness became my only reality. It's as though everything I once understood, the world outside this cursed factory, the noise, the light, has been wiped away, replaced by the cold, oppressive silence that now surrounds me. The shadows have thickened to a point where they no longer feel like just the absence of light. They are alive, pressing against me, crawling under my skin, filling every inch of this suffocating space. I'm not sure how much time has passed since I last moved. My feet feel numb, my legs stiff from standing in the same spot for what feels like hours, maybe days. The silence is so thick now that I can hardly tell where I end and the darkness begins. But then a sound, a faint scraping noise, like metal against stone. It's not loud, but it's there, piercing through the silence. I feel it before I hear it, an unsettling tremor in the air, a vibration in the floor that seems to travel up my legs and into my bones. It's a noise I don't want to hear, because with it comes the realization that the factory is not just a place. It's alive. I turn toward the source of the sound, my body moving on its own, propelled by some instinct I don't understand. The factory floor stretches out before me in an endless expanse of shadow, but in the distance, I see it, the walls. They are not what they seem. I had thought they were just crumbling, rusted remnants of some forgotten time, but now in the heart of this darkness, I realize something terrifying. The walls are alive too. They groan, creak, and shift, as if they're breathing. The metal panels seem to bend and twist, and there's a sound, a whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It's a murmur, low and guttural, as though the walls themselves are speaking. "We've been waiting for you." The voice comes from all directions, echoing off the metal and stone, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. It's not just a whisper anymore. It's a call, a summons that pulls at my very soul. My body shakes involuntarily, as though the sound is vibrating through every cell, every fiber of my being. I want to scream, to run, to escape, but my mouth refuses to cooperate. The silence swallows any sound I try to make, leaving only the oppressive hum of the factory, of the walls that speak. The whisper continues, its tone growing darker, more insistent. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." I take a step back, my breath shallow, my mind reeling. I try to process what I'm hearing, but it doesn't make sense. This place, this factory shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't be alive. It shouldn't speak, but it does. The walls tremble again, and I feel the ground shift beneath me. The air grows even colder, and I realize, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that the shadows are drawing closer, closing in on me. The factory is alive, yes, but it's more than that. It's watching me. It's feeding on me. And I realize something else, something even more horrifying. The walls aren't just alive. They know me. They remember me. "We've been waiting for you to hear us." The voice is so close now, like a whisper directly in my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. I close my eyes, trying to block out the sound, trying to convince myself that this is all a nightmare, that I'll wake up, that the factory will fade away like some bad dream. But I don't wake up. The factory doesn't disappear. It breathes. I open my eyes again, and that's when I see it. A shadow shifts in the corner of the room. At first, I think it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I realize it's moving. The walls are alive, and within them something else is stirring. A figure, distorted and warped, begins to form within the shadows. Its outline flickers in and out of existence, like it's not entirely part of this world. It's tall, impossibly tall, with arms that seem to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. It's humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its body twisted in ways that make my skin crawl. And its face is a blur, a mass of shifting darkness, like it's made of the very shadows that haunt the factory. The voice comes again, this time not from the walls but from the figure itself. "You shouldn't have come. I can feel it. The presence, the thing that's watching me. It's not just in the walls anymore, it's in the air, in the shadows, in every breath I take. The room shifts again, and this time I'm aware of the full scale of the transformation. The walls are no longer static, they pulse, undulate as if they're alive, breathing in time with me. The floor shakes beneath my feet, and I feel the vibration travel through my body, into my bones. The factory is alive, and it's changing, reshaping itself. It's welcoming me. I try to move, to force myself to run, but my legs refuse to obey. It's like the factory is holding me in place, trapping me in its grasp. The shadows are all around me now, enveloping me, crawling under my skin, suffocating me. The walls speak, not just in whispers but in words I can't understand, a language older than time, more ancient than anything I've ever known. We've been waiting for you. You are ours. I feel it then, the pressure on my chest, the weight of the shadows pulling me down. The darkness isn't just around me, it's inside me. It's consuming me, piece by piece. My breath is shallow, my heart racing, but no matter how hard I try to move, to scream, to fight, I can't. And then the figure in the shadows steps forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its face still nothing but a blur of shifting darkness. It reaches for me, its cold, shadowy hand inches from my face. I feel its touch before I see it, cold and heavy, like the weight of the entire factory pressing down on me. And I hear the voice again, but this time it's not a whisper. It's a command, sharp and final. Stay. And in that moment, I understand. The factory, the shadows, the walls that speak, they aren't just alive, they are waiting. And I am part of it now. I will never leave. Not now. Not ever. I can feel it now deep within me. This thing inside the walls, inside the shadows, inside the factory itself. It's more than just a presence, it's a part of me. The shadows, once distant, are now intertwined with my every thought, like vines winding through my mind, tugging at the very core of who I am. And the whispers, the voices that used to be distant echoes, now fill my every waking moment, wrapping themselves around me until I can no longer tell where I end and they begin. You belong here. The words come from the walls again, and they are no longer just whispers. They are truths. I feel them in my bones, in the marrow of my soul, resonating in the deepest corners of my being. The factory is alive, and so am I. Alive in a way I never thought possible. But at what cost? I remember when I first stepped inside this place. I had thought it was just an abandoned factory, a place long forgotten by time. But it was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be watched. It was meant to be listened to. And now, I have listened. The price of listening is the price of becoming one with the factory, one with the shadows, one with the darkness that moves behind the walls and in the spaces between time. There is no turning back now. The moment I let the whispers in, the moment I let the shadows touch me, I sealed my fate. The figure, the one that moved in the darkness, the one I had felt lurking behind me, is standing before me now. I can see it clearly, or perhaps it is I who am now shifting in and out of focus. Its body is a dark silhouette, a shifting form that seems to melt into the shadows themselves, and its face, that featureless blur of darkness, is almost soothing in its emptiness. It doesn't need to speak. I know what it wants. The factory has given me a gift, no, a curse, one that I can never escape. Its walls have spoken to me, and now I am part of them. I can feel it coursing through my veins, an unnatural energy, a pulse that syncs with the hum of the factory, with the ticking of its machines that have long since stopped running. I try to scream, to force the words out, to beg for mercy, but nothing comes. The silence has stolen my voice. The walls have stolen my ability to speak, to make sound. All that's left is the constant hum of the factory, of the shadow in the corner, of the thing that is watching me. I take a step backward, but the ground beneath me is no longer solid. It feels like the factory floor is giving way, like it's sinking into the earth, pulling me with it. The walls around me warp, distort, as though they are breathing in time with the pounding of my heart. The whispers rise to a crescendo. You are ours now. I am not sure when I lost the ability to move, to escape. But I know as I stand here, paralyzed by the weight of my own fate, that this place has claimed me. I am nothing more than a part of it now, a voice among the millions that have fallen silent before me, a shadow among the shadows that have haunted this factory for decades. The price of listening is never being able to unhear it. The price of listening is losing yourself, your humanity, your very soul, until you are as much a part of this place as the rusted machines and decaying walls. The price of listening is becoming one with the factory's voice, a voice that never stops, that never lets you forget what you are. The figure in front of me steps forward, its form stretching impossibly tall. It raises one hand, reaching for me with cold skeletal fingers, and I feel its touch, cold and familiar, like an old friend that I can no longer recognize. I want to pull away, to run, but there's no escaping now. The shadows have already claimed me, and I know now. I know what I have become. I am the factory's newest whisper. I am the price of listening.
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.